For over 2 decades, Brad had been convinced that his marriage was solid, unshakable even. He and Marie had built a life together through years of dedication, raising a daughter, and weathering life's storms as a unit. There were routine moments of discontent, as in any long-term relationship, but Brad never doubted the foundation they had laid. Trust, loyalty, and mutual respect were pillars of their union, or so he had believed. Even in their quieter years, when passion ebbed and life's obligations took precedence, he had never questioned Marie's devotion. Everything had started shifting subtly over the past year. At first, it was easy to dismiss. Late nights at work, new friendships, and an increasing interest in fitness. Marie had always been a beautiful woman, but she became noticeably more invested in her appearance, adopting a rigorous workout schedule and revamping her wardrobe with youthful, stylish outfits. She credited the changes to self-improvement and aging gracefully, and Brad, trusting as ever, applauded her for it. He was proud of her newfound energy, completely oblivious to the deeper motivations behind it. It wasn't until his business trips increased that the cracks began to form in his carefully maintained illusion of a perfect marriage. Each time he returned, there were subtle signs. Strange receipts in the trash, unfamiliar cologne clinging to the sheets, a slight unease in Marie's demeanor. He had brushed it off, convincing himself he was imagining things, that the paranoia was unfounded. But deep down, a whisper of doubt took root, festering in the recesses of his mind, quietly eroding the trust he had once held so firmly. The turning point came when he made an unplanned stop at their old cabin, a place they had rarely used in recent years. He had expected to find the structure in disrepair, empty and forgotten. Instead, he found signs of recent habitation, subtle but undeniable. A freshly washed coffee cup in the sink, the faint scent of perfume lingering in the air, a slightly ajar drawer containing lingerie that Marie had never worn for him. It was then that he realized his wife had secrets. And Brad wasn't sure he was ready for the truth. Brad sat in front of his laptop, his expression hardened as he watched the video in tense silence. On the screen, a petite, mature blonde woman entered a dimly lit room, wrapped in the embrace of a tall, well-built man. Her short, curly hair was styled in a familiar way, one he had seen countless times before. A bright, eager smile played on her lips as she trailed her fingers over the man's muscular chest, her excitement barely contained. The man towering beside her was noticeably younger. He had short, dark hair, broad shoulders, and a lean, athletic frame. Brad quickly gauged that he was a few inches taller than himself, though likely close in weight. However, when the man peeled off his shirt and tossed it aside, it became glaringly obvious. His body was all muscle, no excess. The moment they stepped into the room, he pulled the woman into a hungry kiss, wasting no time. She didn't resist as he stripped her down. Brad's stomach twisted as he recognized the lingerie she was wearing, the delicate set Marie had worn just last month for their anniversary. Their 25th year together was supposed to be special. After a lovely dinner with their daughter and son-in-law, he had taken his wife dancing at an upscale nightclub. The evening had been filled with romance, laughter, and nostalgia. Later, they had checked into a luxury hotel where, slightly tipsy, they had made love like they had for nearly 3 decades, gently, tenderly, in the way that had always defined their marriage. That night had been perfect, and Brad clung to the memory. He could still picture Marie standing at the foot of their bed, slipping out of her dress with a teasing smile. She had twirled playfully, showing off the new lingerie, the soft rose-colored fabric, a stunning contrast against her porcelain skin. He had adored the way she looked, the way she moved, the way she had made him feel. But now, that cherished memory was tainted. His throat tightened as he forced himself to continue watching her betrayal unfold on the screen. The younger man effortlessly lifted her into his arms and carried her across the small room before dropping her roughly onto a worn-out sofa. She didn't seem to mind the rough treatment. Instead, she quickly repositioned herself and unfastened his belt with practiced ease. The smug satisfaction on the man's face as she attended to him made Brad's insides churn. Brad paid close attention to the details. The man stood still, watching her, waiting for her to take control. She knew exactly what to do, as if this wasn't her first time. Soon, she was bent over the back of the sofa, facing away from the camera. He couldn't see her face, but he didn't need to. Her body language spoke volumes. When the man grabbed a fistful of her short hair and yanked her head back, forcing her into an arched position, it became painfully clear just how much she was enjoying it. Her mouth hung open, saliva trailing from her lips, her entire expression twisted in an obscene display of pleasure. Brad was stunned. He had never known this side of Marie. To him, she had always been a devoted wife, modest, even reserved. Their bed life had always been affectionate and gentle, a natural extension of their deep bond. She would often whisper to him afterward how much she loved the way he cared for her, how safe she felt in his arms. They would lie together, basking in the warmth of their connection, content in the love they had built over decades. What he was witnessing now was nothing like that. This was raw, animalistic, devoid of any tenderness. It was as if the woman in the video was someone else entirely. This man was giving her something Brad never could, and the worst part, she wanted it, craved it. Her body moved with desperation, writhing under the man's control, proving to Brad that she was getting something from him that had been missing in their marriage. So engrossed in the video, Brad barely registered the soft chime of his phone, a text. From her. Going straight to the store from work. Want anything special for dinner? His fingers hovered over the screen before he finally replied, Nothing special. See you when you get home. He almost typed, love you, out of habit. But as he stared at the images still playing on his laptop, the undeniable evidence of her infidelity, his heart turned ice cold. A moment later, her response popped up. Okay, see you at home. Love you, baby. Yeah, right, he muttered under his breath. He glanced at the clock. She would be home in about an hour. Marie, 52, worked as an administrative assistant in the admissions office at the local community college, just a few miles away. She had taken the job a few years ago after leaving a smaller company where she had worked as a secretary. Since her schedule started later and ended later than his, Brad was usually home first, unless he had to stay late at work. Brad Kendallson, 55, had been a financial analyst for the past 12 years. His work was demanding, often requiring his full focus and energy. Many of his clients were wealthy businessmen who were understandably meticulous about their finances, meaning Brad had to be sharp at all times. His job also required occasional travel, which, ironically, was how he had stumbled upon Marie's secret life. A few months ago, he had returned from a business trip in a nearby city. Normally, he would fly, but this time he decided to drive since it took roughly the same amount of time. On his way home, on a whim, he chose to stop by the old cabin he and Marie owned, just to check on it. The cabin was small and rustic, nestled deep in the hills about 45 minutes from their home. It had electricity, a working well, a tiny propane stove, and a fireplace for warmth. Simple, functional, but lacking any real luxury. Marie had inherited it after her mother passed, though it originally belonged to her late father. In the decade they had owned it, they had only used it 3 times, the last being a quiet weekend retreat 2 years prior. Lately, Brad had been considering selling it. It wasn't in the best condition, and they barely used it. The only thing it had going for it was its location, 1 acre of land near a picturesque lake, part of a small, secluded community of similar cabins. There was no real security on the property, just a flimsy chain-link fence stretched across the dirt road leading to the cabins, a leftover from when the land had belonged to an old farmer who had sold off the lots to fund his retirement. Brad hadn't expected to find anything unusual. He had only intended to make sure no squatters had taken up residence, or that vandals hadn't trashed the place. As Brad navigated the winding dirt road leading to the secluded cabin, he found himself wondering who might even want such a remote, rustic getaway. Perhaps an older couple like him and Marie, looking for a quiet retreat, or maybe a group of hunters passing through. The place had never been in high demand. The key was still hidden beneath the same flat rock in the small garden, exactly where they had always left it. Retrieving it, Brad let himself inside. Once inside, he began his usual routine of checking things over. The well was still functioning, and everything seemed in order at first. But when he stepped into the bathroom, he noticed something that made him pause. The shower curtain wasn't pushed all the way to the side. That was strange. He distinctly remembered leaving it fully drawn back the last time they had been here. Then he spotted another detail, a faint ring of soap residue around the sink's drain. It was subtle, but Brad knew it hadn't been there before. He had cleaned that sink thoroughly when they last left. A creeping unease settled in his chest. Someone had been here. Someone had used the cabin since he and Marie's last visit 2 years ago. Continuing his inspection, he found nothing broken or missing, but little things were out of place. The chairs around the kitchen table had been slightly rearranged, and a few minor details in the bedroom seemed off. He stepped outside, searching the grounds for more signs. The only thing that stood out were faint tire tracks in the dirt driveway. It was impossible to tell how old they were, but one thing was certain. The surrounding cabins appeared untouched, abandoned even. It seemed like no one else had set foot in the area for years. After nearly half an hour of searching, Brad tried to make sense of it. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. Had Marie come here without mentioning it? That didn't seem likely. If she had, she would have told him. And yet, someone had definitely been inside. But if a squatter had broken in, why wasn't there any sign of forced entry? Why was nothing disturbed or ransacked? If vandals had trespassed, they would have left a mess. Instead, whoever had been here had taken care to leave things almost exactly as they were. Almost. The shower curtain, the soap stains, the barely shifted furniture. Whoever had used the cabin had been careful, but not careful enough to erase all traces. And for some reason, Brad chose not to tell Marie. He wasn't usually a suspicious man, but something about this felt off. He had always trusted his wife, loved her without question for decades, but this was unsettling. He couldn't shake the feeling that she knew something about it. If he confronted her now, it would sound like an accusation, and he wasn't ready for that. Not yet. He needed more than just a gut feeling before he asked any questions. Acting on instinct, Brad stopped by an electronics store on his way home and bought an expensive set of high-definition surveillance cameras. He returned to the cabin later that evening and installed them discreetly, one overlooking the porch, another covering the living room and kitchen, and a third in the bedroom, positioned to capture the bathroom if the door was left open. Without saying a word to Marie, Brad began making regular trips to the cabin every weekend. It was easy to come up with small excuses for his absence: running errands, taking drives, anything that wouldn't raise suspicion. It wasn't like she noticed much. She was often out shopping, visiting friends, or spending hours at the health spa she had joined the year before. Lately, she had been more focused on fitness, shedding 15 pounds and toning up her figure. He had to admit, she looked great for her age. The surveillance cameras were motion-activated, so the first couple of times he checked, there was nothing recorded. He started thinking he had been paranoid, that he was wasting his time. But on the third visit, there was footage. His heart pounded as he downloaded the recordings, eager to confirm whether someone had been trespassing. What he saw instead shattered his world. There she was, his wife, Marie, stepping out of a sleek sports car, her laughter carrying through the crisp air as she walked up to the cabin. Beside her was a tall man, at least half her age. They looked comfortable, familiar. Hand in hand, they approached the front door, and with practiced ease, Marie reached under the rock, pulled out the hidden key, and let them inside. Brad's fists clenched as he watched the footage unfold. The moment they crossed the threshold, the man pulled Marie into a heated embrace, their lips colliding in a way that left no doubt about their relationship. She melted into him effortlessly, like a woman completely lost in passion. It was the same way she had once kissed Brad. Disgust roiled in his gut. Another betrayal, another piece of irrefutable evidence. His wife wasn't just cheating. She was using their cabin, a place that was supposed to be theirs, as her secret hideaway. The realization was nauseating. He felt physically sick, but forced himself to keep watching, his jaw clenched so tight it hurt. That night, Brad left the cabin in a daze, his mind reeling. He made sure everything was exactly as he had found it, so Marie wouldn't know he had been there. But he knew the truth now. He had no doubt this wasn't the first time she had brought her lover here, and if he didn't act soon, it wouldn't be the last. Every fiber of his being screamed for vengeance. The thought of confronting her, of making her pay for her betrayal, of tracking down that fool and knocking him to a pulp, it all burned in his veins. He wanted to tear everything down, to destroy their home, to erase every memory he had ever shared with her. But on the drive back, he forced himself to stay calm, at least calm enough to think clearly. Just an hour ago, he had still believed he had a faithful wife. Just an hour ago, he had trusted her, loved her. But now, everything had changed. His father's voice echoed in his head. Never react without thinking. Wise words, but his father had never dealt with something like this. How could she do this to him? 25 years of marriage, thrown away like it meant nothing. The deeper he thought, the more questions tormented him. Was this the first time? Her ease with the man, her confidence in sneaking around. It was hard to believe this was a one-time mistake. But what if it was? What if this was her first slip-up? Could he really destroy their marriage over a single lapse in judgment? Until tonight, he had thought she was a devoted wife. Had she ever truly loved him the way he had loved her? Brad felt sick. He hated her. He despised her. And yet, he still loved her. That's what hurt the most. And then a terrifying realization struck him. If he left her, if he divorced her, what then? He was 55, slightly overweight, not rich, not exactly a catch. But Marie? She still had options. The video proved that. She was still attractive, still desirable. She wouldn't have trouble moving on. But what about him? Who would want him now? These thoughts haunted him as he pulled into the driveway. The house was quiet. Marie wasn't home. A note sat on the kitchen table. Out shopping. Be home later. Love you. Brad grabbed the note and ripped it into pieces, his hands shaking with rage. Shopping? Or was she with him? That had been over a month ago. Since then, Brad had gathered 2 more damning videos of his wife's ongoing infidelity at the cabin. The latest one was the most sickening yet. Marie, draped over the arm of the sofa, completely lost in her passion with that younger man. This wasn't some fleeting mistake or a moment of weakness. The 3 recordings proved that this was deliberate, calculated, and ongoing. Worse, it was always with the same guy. After witnessing the first video, Brad had somehow managed to maintain his composure. He forced himself to act normally around his unfaithful wife, masking his disgust while quietly observing her every move. Now that he knew the truth, he became hyper-aware of her routines, her habits, and the places she frequented. He briefly considered hiring a private investigator, but decided against it. If things played out the way he was planning, he didn't want any outside interference or anyone realizing how much he already knew. Instead, he took matters into his own hands. He discreetly installed a GPS tracker in Marie's car, allowing him to monitor her whereabouts from his computer. At first, everything seemed routine. Her usual stops at the grocery store, shopping malls, work, and various errands. After a week of tracking her, Brad doubted that her affair was with anyone from her office. Twice, he even took a day off to tail her after work. But each time, she went straight home, except on the days she worked out. Other than shopping, the health spa she had joined a few months ago was the only place she consistently spent extended periods of time. That became his focus. Brad had originally been supportive when Marie mentioned wanting to get in better shape. He encouraged her decision to join a gym, even complimenting her as she toned up and dropped nearly 15 pounds. She had always been attractive, but with her renewed dedication to fitness, she looked even better than before. He had been proud of her efforts. What a fool he had been. Now, everything made sense. The man in the videos had the kind of sculpted, muscular physique that screamed gym rat. Brad began to suspect that the health spa was where this affair had started. Determined to confirm his suspicions, he decided to follow Marie after work one evening, arriving at the spa ahead of her and parking at a safe distance. Through the large front windows, he could see inside. He watched as she entered and exchanged pleasantries with the staff. But one interaction stood out. Her familiarity with a particular young man. Dark hair, lean, muscular, confident. Brad discreetly snapped a few photos with his camera. When Marie finished her workout, the man walked her to her car. They spoke casually, laughing as though they shared an inside joke. Then, just before she got into her vehicle, she reached out and placed her hand on his arm. He responded by slipping an arm around her waist and giving her a light kiss on the cheek. Marie smiled up at him, warmth in her eyes. Brad's stomach twisted as he gritted his teeth and drove home. Once he was back, he locked himself in his office and pulled up the spa's website. It didn't take long to find him. Oscar Pitford, 28, personal trainer. For the next several days, Brad kept a close watch on the spa, staking it out from a distance. Each time Marie arrived, Oscar was there, paying her extra attention, always finding an excuse to be close to her. It was painfully obvious. This wasn't innocent. This was an affair. Oscar had the demeanor of a smooth-talking ladies' man. No doubt he had plenty of women wrapped around his finger. Marie was just another conquest. The attention, the flirtation, she had fallen for it, just like so many others before her. Brad was convinced that she had suggested using the cabin as their secret hideaway. And, as much as he hated to admit it, it was a calculated move. Using their marital home would have been too risky. Neighbors could notice something, Brad's schedule was unpredictable, and there was always a chance of leaving behind incriminating evidence. A motel? Too traceable. If she was seen entering or leaving with another man, someone might talk. But the cabin? Remote. Private. no paper trail. And Marie knew Brad never went there. If he hadn't stopped by that day after his business trip, he would never have known. For an entire week after discovering the first recording, Brad somehow managed to suppress his growing rage. The only way he kept from snapping was by physically removing himself from the house whenever he felt his anger bubbling over. But it was getting harder to pretend. Then came the latest video, the one where Marie was perched on the arm of the sofa, utterly consumed by her lust for another man. Watching her like that again filled Brad with cold fury. It was obvious. She had no intention of stopping. If anything, she seemed more eager than ever. Even if she did end the affair, would it really matter? Could he ever look at her the same way again? Could he share a bed with her, hold her, love her, knowing what she had done? From the moment he saw that first video, he knew their marriage was doomed. And yet, instead of confronting her, he played his role. Acting oblivious allowed him time to think, to plan. As a financial analyst, Brad knew how to protect himself. He quietly started moving funds, securing his assets so Marie wouldn't be able to take half in a divorce. He couldn't leave her penniless, but he could ensure she didn't walk away comfortably. He also considered revenge, something that would hurt her as much as she had hurt him. But the reality was, any drastic action could backfire. He wasn't a violent man. He wasn't some skilled ex-agent plotting an elaborate takedown. He was just a regular guy, a husband betrayed by the woman he had trusted for 25 years, so he plotted carefully. Revenge first, then divorce. The details could come later. Just then, he heard the familiar sound of Marie's car pulling into the garage. Brad inhaled sharply, his stomach knotting. He had to shove his emotions down, force his expression into neutrality. He couldn't let her see what he knew. The door to the garage opened, and Marie walked in, a bag of groceries in her arms. "Hey, honey," she greeted, flashing him that same bright smile she always did, the one that had once made his heart warm. Now it only filled him with disgust. He barely heard her as she strolled across the kitchen, set the bag down, and leaned in to kiss his cheek. "Hey, Marie," he replied, keeping his voice level. "Are you hungry?" she asked, opening the fridge. "Because I'm starving. I picked up some steaks. Why don't you fire up the grill while I make a salad?" Brad forced himself to smile. "Sounds good. I'll get started." Keeping his face composed, he stepped out onto the deck to light the grill. Ever since watching the latest recording of Marie in the cabin, Brad found it harder to pretend. He used to cherish their dinners together, sharing stories, exchanging laughter, enjoying the simple comfort of their long-standing bond. Now, sitting across from her at the table felt like an exercise in restraint. He no longer saw the woman he had loved for 25 years. Instead, she had morphed into a stranger, a woman whose body was no longer his, whose affections had been sold to a younger, more virile man. Still, he had to give her credit. Her performance was flawless. Marie walked through the door each day, wearing the same warm smile, exuding the same affectionate demeanor, as if she weren't sneaking off to betray him at every opportunity. If he hadn't seen the proof with his own eyes, he might have continued believing she was the devoted wife she pretended to be. They were both acting now. The difference was she was far better at it. For Brad, every moment in her presence felt like torture. There had been times, more than he cared to count, where the urge to lash out to expose her lies had nearly overwhelmed him. But somehow he had held back. For now. What fascinated him was how effortlessly she juggled her double life. On one side, she was carrying on an affair without hesitation or guilt. On the other, she played the role of the loving, committed wife to perfection. There was no remorse in her eyes, no hesitation in her movements. If anything, she seemed more attentive than before. Where he had once found himself initiating closeness, now she was the one reaching for him, running her fingers down his back, whispering sweet nothings before they fell asleep. And in the mornings, she had started waking him with soft touches, encouraging him to relieve his frustrations before heading off to work. Pity's ex. At first, he thought it was an effort to quell her guilt, but after watching her with her lover, seeing the raw, unfiltered passion she poured into him, Brad knew she didn't feel guilty at all. He had spent years believing Marie was an honest woman. Now, he saw her for what she truly was. Dinner was a quiet affair. Brad grilled the steaks while Marie prepared a salad. They exchanged a few words about trivial things, work, errands, the weather. But for the most part, silence lingered between them. She ate sparingly, sneaking glances at him every so often, as if trying to gauge his mood. Brad kept his expression neutral. If he spoke too much, if he let his guard down for even a moment, he knew his anger would bleed through. They usually lingered over coffee and dessert after dinner. Not tonight. As soon as he finished eating, he got up from the table, needing space. He cleaned up his plate and retreated to the living room, turning on the TV for some mindless distraction. Marie followed shortly after, a glass of wine in hand. She settled next to him on the couch, crossing her legs, her body turned slightly toward him. He could feel her eyes on him. Brad clenched his jaw. He should have gone to his office. If he left now, it would seem suspicious. During a commercial break, she finally broke the silence. "Is everything okay, Brad?" His stomach twisted. She was onto him. He kept his shoulders relaxed, his face unreadable. "I'm fine." She studied him for a moment. "You seem tense today." Reaching over, she ran a hand gently down his arm. "Something wrong at work? You know you can talk to me." Brad felt his throat tighten. He forced his voice to remain steady. "No, everything's fine." He should have left it at that, but the words came before he could stop them. "Why do you ask?" His tone was casual, eyes fixed on the screen. Marie hesitated, swirling her wine. "I don't know," she admitted. "It's just, you seem different lately." After a pause, she shifted closer, curling into his side, her fingers tracing slow circles on his forearm. "Maybe we need some time together," she murmured. "I feel like we've been distant." Brad choked on a bitter laugh. "Distant?" She giggled, a coy smile playing on her lips. "Yeah, I miss you, honey. I was starting to think you weren't attracted to me anymore." Unbelievable. She was toying with him. After everything, she had the nerve to pretend she was the neglected one. The woman who had spent months betraying him was now acting as though she was starved for his attention. He forced out a laugh, but it came out stiff and unnatural. Marie's smile faltered. "You know I am," he said, though the words felt hollow. They chuckled, but it was an empty sound. She turned back to the TV, the moment passing, but Brad felt the tension hanging in the air. Before all of this, Brad had always been the one to initiate closeness. For years, he had been the one reaching for her, dropping subtle hints, making the first move. More often than not, she had brushed him off, claiming exhaustion, stress, or just not being in the mood. He had never questioned it. Now, he knew better. Her signals had always been easy to read. A teasing glance, a flirtatious touch, a playful kiss that lingered just long enough. That was all it had ever taken for him to eagerly follow her to the bedroom. But now he knew she had given herself to another man. Once he had craved her. Now he recoiled. He had resisted for weeks, refusing to touch her, distancing himself more and more each night. At first, the absence of closeness wasn't obvious, but now Marie was beginning to notice. She was trying harder. Brad refused to give in. He had watched her, seen her completely lose herself in the arms of someone else. She had never reacted that way with him. She had never been that wild, that uninhibited, that insatiable. It wasn't just sex. It was desire, and it had never been for him. Marie sighed, shifting beside him. "I just thought—" She hesitated. "I don't know, maybe we could go to bed a little early tonight." Brad's stomach twisted. "Are you tired?" "No, silly," she laughed, swatting at his arm. "I mean, do you want to, go upstairs?" He knew exactly what she was asking, and his body responded despite himself. She smelled incredible. Her perfume, the warmth of her skin, the way her toned body pressed against him. It was intoxicating. He hadn't forgotten what it felt like to touch her, to have her melt beneath his hands. His blood ran hot, betraying him, but he wouldn't give her the satisfaction. "Maybe in a bit," he said evenly. "Go on up. I just want to finish watching this." Marie snorted in disappointment. She hesitated a moment, then stood, brushing a hand against his shoulder as she walked away. Brad clenched his fists as he watched her leave. Even after everything, he still wanted her. That was the cruelest part of it all. But he wouldn't break. Not tonight. The show wasn't even finished when Marie stretched with an exaggerated yawn, arching her back, subtly pulling her blouse tight across her chest. A move meant to catch his eye. Brad didn't react. When her attempt failed, she sighed, playing up her disappointment. "I think I'll turn in for the night. You coming to bed?" The invitation was obvious. It had been years since she'd been this forward. "I'll be up soon," he responded, keeping his tone flat. "Oh, okay." She hesitated. "Wake me when you come up. I probably won't be asleep right away." "All right, see you soon." She lingered for a moment, studying him as if searching for some kind of reaction. When she got nothing, she kissed his cheek and left the room. Brad let out a slow, controlled breath and remained on the couch for another 3 hours. It was after 1 a.m. when he finally made his way upstairs. Pausing at the bedroom door, he listened. Her breathing was steady, deep. She was asleep. Only then did he step inside, undressing quietly before slipping into bed beside her. But sleep didn't come. His thoughts swirled with anger, disgust, and frustration. By morning, Brad still felt drained. He got up early, carefully pulling his clothes together before heading to the guest room to dress. He didn't want to wake her. The resentment clawed at him, but he clung to his pride. He refused to touch her. She wasn't his anymore, not in any way that mattered. He missed what they had once been, the ease of sliding into bed next to his wife, kissing her, pulling her close without hesitation. But that was gone. She had destroyed it, and he wasn't about to pretend otherwise. Marie had made her choice, and Brad wasn't going to reward her betrayal by pretending their marriage was still real. If she needed Zek so badly, she could run back to her boy toy and let him handle her. She belonged to him now. The house became thick with tension. Marie sensed the shift. Something had changed. Brad barely spoke to her, keeping their interactions short, distant. They still ate dinner together, but the conversations were minimal. No laughter, no warmth, no affectionate gestures. When she touched his arm, he pulled away. When she hugged him, he stiffened. When she reached for his hand, he avoided it. She knew something was wrong, but he wouldn't tell her what. She tried to get him to open up, but he either brushed off her concerns or redirected the conversation. For years, she had relied on his steady presence, his quiet affection. Now, there was a wall between them, and for the first time in their marriage, she couldn't break through it. That night, she tried again. Marie made a show of changing into one of his favorite silk nightgowns, slipping into bed, stretching in a way that highlighted the curves she knew he once adored. Brad barely looked at her. She wondered, does he know? No, it wasn't possible. She and Oscar had been careful. At the spa, they behaved like casual acquaintances. No one suspected a thing. The cabin was their secret. Her husband's behavior was puzzling, but not alarming. She convinced herself it was work stress, just another rough patch. She still loved him, after all. Their marriage was fine. Sure, she hadn't been as affectionate before the affair, but that wasn't entirely her fault. Brad had never been an exciting lover. Their bed life had been routine, predictable. Oscar had changed everything. For the first time in years, Marie felt truly alive. Brad was becoming distant, yes, but wasn't it natural for marriages to go through ups and downs? She still wanted to keep him happy, even if she saved her real passion for someone else. And yet, she couldn't understand why he didn't want her anymore. Marie studied herself in the mirror. She looked better than she had in years, slimmer, toned, radiant. Men noticed her now. Even at work, younger men, college-aged, flirted with her. She didn't encourage them, of course. She wasn't reckless, but it was flattering, knowing she still had it. But with Oscar, she could let go, be free. And when she returned home to Brad, it was easy to slip back into her role as the devoted wife. As the days passed, Brad's coldness began to bother her. She told Oscar they needed to pause the affair for a while, just until things settled at home. Oscar was irritated, but agreed. He thought she was overreacting. But by the second week without him, Marie was struggling. Her body craved him. She couldn't stop thinking about their encounters at the cabin, about the intensity, the passion, the pleasure. And being surrounded by young, attractive men at work wasn't helping. Before the affair, she had barely noticed them. Now she caught herself fantasizing about them. Her hunger had been awakened, and she couldn't suppress it anymore. When she finally couldn't take it, she made a decision. During her weekly workout, she approached Oscar and let him know she was ready to start again. She needed him. They kept their distance in public, playing their usual game of restraint. But their next meeting was already set. Brad had mentioned a business trip later that week, the perfect opportunity. As Marie left the gym that evening, she felt electric. The anticipation, the secrecy, the excitement, it all made her feel alive. At home, she moved with renewed energy. The dullness of the past few weeks faded, replaced with an eager thrill. Brad noticed. At dinner, she was practically glowing. She barely noticed the way he studied her, the way he watched her movements carefully. She was too caught up in what was coming next. By Friday, her excitement was impossible to hide. Even her boss took note. "You look happy today, Marie," he said, raising an eyebrow. "Something good happen?" Marie smirked. "Nothing special," he chuckled. "Did Brad surprise you with something? Or did you win the lottery?" She laughed. "No surprises. I'm just..." Feeling good. Well, whatever it is, I haven't seen you this happy in a long time, Marie beamed. I'm just appreciating life. Things aren't perfect, but they're good. Her boss nodded approvingly. That's a great mindset. Marie left work floating on air. Her body hummed with anticipation. That night, she was meeting Oscar. As she walked to her car, the excitement coursed through her veins. Her body needed him. She could already feel his hands on her, his lips trailing down her skin, his breath against her ear. Marie bit her lip as she slid into her car, her heart pounding. The moment Marie stepped inside, the rich aroma of home-cooked food wrapped around her, instantly making her mouth water. From the kitchen, the scent of a warm, savory meal drifted toward her, and to her delight, Brad had already taken care of dinner. A smile spread across her lips as she slipped her arms around his waist, leaning into his warmth. To her surprise, he not only embraced her, but pressed a soft kiss to her cheek. "This is a lovely surprise," she murmured, glancing at the beautifully set table. "Want a glass of wine with dinner?" Brad nodded. "That sounds good." Marie smirked playfully. "Just one, though. I don't want to get too sleepy. I have plans for you later as a proper thank you." Brad chuckled, amusement flickering in his eyes. "Your happiness is thanks enough," she laughed. "Oh no, I have something much better in mind. It's been too long. I need to remind my incredible husband how much he means to me." Brad's smile was polite but measured. "You're pretty wonderful, too." Dinner was the easiest their conversations had been in weeks. The usual tension between them seemed to ease, replaced by rare, comfortable warmth. Marie felt a flicker of hope. Maybe things were shifting in the right direction. After they finished eating and cleared the dishes, they settled in front of the TV, slipping into their usual evening routine. But tonight, Marie had something different in mind. She wasn't about to let the moment pass. During a commercial break, she touched his arm lightly and excused herself, heading to the bedroom. Digging through her dresser, she pulled out something daring, a fitted tank top that hugged her curves and a pair of snug shorts. Then, reconsidering, she smirked at her reflection and ditched the shorts entirely, opting for just thin bikini underwear beneath the tank. She ran a hand over her hips, inspecting herself in the mirror. Even now, she knew she looked good, seductive, confident. There was no way Brad could resist her tonight. Feeling emboldened, she sauntered back into the living room, anticipation thrumming in her chest. But he wasn't on the couch. He was still in the kitchen. Marie stretched out on the sofa, positioning herself just right, letting her legs appear longer, her posture inviting. She waited. Minutes later, Brad walked in carrying a beer and another glass of wine. His gaze flicked over her outfit, his brows lifting slightly, but his expression remained unreadable. She patted the spot beside her, lips curving into a slow, suggestive smile. "I topped off your glass," he said, handing her the wine. "Hope you were in the mood for more." Taking it from him, she let her fingers graze his, her voice dipping into something sultry. "Oh, I'm in the mood for more," she murmured. "More than just wine." Brad took a sip of his beer, his lips twitching in amusement. That much is obvious. She knew exactly what she was doing. The way she sat, the way the fabric clung to her, the way she leaned just enough to give him the perfect view. She was offering herself to him. And yet, he didn't bite. Instead, his focus remained on the TV. Time ticked by. Frustrated, she edged closer, letting her body press against his. The television droned in the background as she rested her head on his shoulder, trailing her fingers lightly along his arm, waiting for a reaction. Still, nothing. Why wasn't he responding? She had made it so easy. She was right there, ready, waiting. The hum of the TV blurred into white noise. The wine warmed her, making her limbs feel heavy, her eyelids droop. She fought to stay awake, waiting for him to make a move. What she didn't know was that Brad had slipped something into her drink. Her body sank into the couch, her eyes fluttering closed before she could stop them. When she woke, the room was dark. A blanket had been draped over her, the TV was off, and Brad was gone. Blinking, she sat up, groggy and disoriented. What the hell? The clock read 4 a.m. Still sluggish, she stumbled toward the bedroom. Inside, Brad was sound asleep, his breathing slow and steady, her jaw clenched. Damn him. She stood there for a moment, staring at him in disbelief. Then exhaustion overtook her again, and she climbed into bed beside him. By morning, irritation simmered beneath her skin. She had practically thrown herself at him, and he had ignored her completely. His loss, she thought bitterly. When she finally dragged herself out of bed, the kitchen was already bathed in sunlight. Brad was at the counter, sipping coffee as if nothing had happened. "Morning, sweetheart," he said casually. "Coffee?" She muttered a groggy, "Yeah," and he handed her a cup with an easy smile. "You fell asleep early last night," he remarked. "Guess you were exhausted." Her frown deepened. "You could have woken me." Brad shrugged. "Figured you needed the rest." His indifference only fueled her irritation, but she let it slide. She wasn't in the mood to argue. Then, as she took another sip of coffee, he set his mug down and looked at her. "How about a weekend away?" Marie blinked. "What?" "The cabin," he said, smiling. "Just us. A couple of days off the grid. We haven't been there in years, and I think we could use a break." She hesitated, caught off guard. After dismissing her off so coldly last night, now he wanted a romantic getaway? "You think we need time alone?" she asked cautiously. Brad chuckled. "I know I haven't been the best at this, but I think stepping away from everything might help us reconnect." He paused, watching her. "Just a weekend. We'll be back before work on Monday." She studied him for a moment, then shrugged. "All right, but we'll need to stop at the store first." "No need," he said smoothly. "I already stocked up." Marie raised a brow. "Oh, look at you, always prepared." "Have to be," he replied with a grin. She smirked, shaking her head. "Fine, let me pack a bag." "Perfect," he said, his enthusiasm unmistakable. "I already packed mine. I'll load up the car while you get ready." The drive to the cabin was silent, the familiar landscape feeling distant, like a faded memory. Marie absent-mindedly reached for her phone, intending to send a message, but the screen remained dark. "Seriously?" she muttered, pressing the button again. "I swear I charged this." Brad glanced over, hands steady on the wheel. "You can use mine if it's important." She shook her head. "It's fine. I'll plug it in when we get there." An hour and a half later, they arrived. The cabin, nestled deep in the woods near the lake, looked exactly as she remembered. Rustic, isolated, untouched by time. Stepping inside, nostalgia mixed with unease. Her gaze swept the room, searching for anything out of place, any sign that her secrets had been exposed. But everything was as it should be. Exhaling in quiet relief, she helped unload their bags and groceries. They made simple sandwiches before heading down to the lake. The air was crisp, the water calm, reflecting the sky in shimmering ripples. The scent of pine filled the evening breeze as birds called from the trees. Brad reached for her hand as they followed the narrow trail, pointing out things along the way. When she stumbled over a rock, he caught her effortlessly, steadying her with a firm grip. For the first time in months, he seemed present, attentive. And for a fleeting moment, Marie felt something close to happiness. But beneath that warmth, guilt lurked. Soon she would be back here, tangled in Oscar's arms. The day passed in a pleasant blur. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they returned to the cabin. Brad put on music, filling the space with soft melodies, and poured them each a glass of wine. They reminisced about their early years, the tension between them loosening with each sip. Curled against him, Marie felt a familiar warmth, a connection she had almost forgotten. When he wrapped his arms around her, something stirred inside her. It had been too long since they had been this close. Later, when they slipped into bed, she was relieved when he stayed beside her instead of rolling away as he so often did at home. Their kisses were slow, unhurried, hands rediscovering familiar territory. "It's been forever," she whispered, arching toward him. "Please, don't tease me. I'm yours." Brad smirked, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Are you now?" "God, yes," she murmured, breathless. "I need you." She let herself get lost in the moment, in his touch, but her mind betrayed her. Unbidden, images of Oscar flashed behind her eyes, his rough hands, the hunger in his kisses, the way he claimed her. Marie forced the thoughts away. This was different. This was love. Just as passion built between them, a noise outside shattered the moment. She froze, breath catching. It wasn't late, only 10 p.m., but out here in the middle of nowhere, there should have been nothing but silence. Then another sound. Brad stiffened. "Did you hear that?" Marie swallowed hard. "Is someone out there?" A dull thud echoed from the porch. Her stomach twisted. She gripped the blanket, knuckles white. "What do we do?" she whispered. Brad sat up, his movements deliberate. "Stay here. I'll check it out." Before he could step away, the doorknob rattled. Marie clamped a hand over her mouth, stifling a gasp. Her heart pounded wildly as Brad crossed the room, reaching into his bag. Then, the door burst open. A figure loomed in the doorway, her breath locked in her throat. An intruder. A scream tore from her lips. A blinding flash filled the cabin, followed by the deafening crack of bang. The force of it rattled through her bones. Another shot. A choked sound. A heavy body hitting the floor. Marie trembled violently, ears ringing, the acrid scent of gunpowder thick in the air. Brad stood in the doorway, tool still raised, breathing hard. Silence. Then, a wet, gurgling noise. A final, shuddering breath. Marie's gaze snapped to the crumpled figure on the floor. A pool of crimson spread beneath him. Her stomach lurched. No. Her vision blurred, the room tilting. The overhead light flickered on. She saw his face. Her heart stopped. Oscar! The breath left her in a ragged sob. Her lover lay lifeless before her, eyes unseeing, mouth frozen in agony. A strangled cry tore from her lips as she clutched her chest, shaking, unable to process the horror. Brad turned toward her, expression unreadable. Slowly, he stepped forward, wrapping his arms around her trembling body. His voice was disturbingly calm as he smoothed her hair. It's over now. Marie buried her face against him, sobbing uncontrollably. Shh, he whispered. We're safe. Her mind spun, struggling to comprehend. After several moments, Brad pulled away, wiping her tears with his thumb. We need to call the cops, he said gently. They'll have to investigate. She nodded numbly. Brad helped her onto the bed, watching as she curled into herself, still shaking. When she eventually stumbled to the bathroom to be sick, he waited for the faucet to run before moving. With quiet precision, he retrieved her phone from her purse. He peeled back the battery cover, removing the small piece of tape he had placed earlier to prevent it from charging. Then he slid the phone back, as if nothing had happened. Turning to the body, he crouched, reaching into Oscar's jacket. Inside was a folded note, one he had printed at a library and discreetly planted on Oscar's car that morning. His jaw tightened as he read, "This pass is good for one night only. Come meet me at the cabin, lover. My husband's gone, and I'm dying for you. No need to knock, just come in. I'll be waiting. Signed, your naughty little promiscuous Marie." Brad crushed the note in his fist and walked outside. Oscar's car sat in the driveway. The surrounding woods swallowed the last traces of daylight. He called over his shoulder. "Be right back, babe. I need to get a signal to call the police." Moving swiftly, he reached the lake. Hidden behind dense shrubs, he lit the note on fire, watching as it curled into blackened ash. He crushed the remnants between two rocks and swept them into the dirt. Taking a steady breath, he composed himself. He had never do that before. But the moment he left that note on Oscar's car, he had known how this night would end. His hands still trembled as he dialed emergency. Now, all that was left was to play his part. No one would ever know the truth. Once the police began questioning Marie, the truth was bound to come out. Even if she didn't confess, investigators would quickly connect her to Oscar. A simple background check would show she was a member of the spa where he worked, making their relationship impossible to hide. The authorities arrived within the hour. Brad, calm and composed, was waiting. He admitted to firing the shots and handed over his pistol, which officers sealed as evidence. When asked if he had touched the body, he firmly denied it. Marie backed him up, her voice trembling but resolute. Suspicion arose when officers discovered the intruder had used a hidden key. "How did he know where to find it?" one asked. Brad admitted they kept a spare outside, but acted clueless about how the man knew. When questioned separately, Marie cracked almost immediately, guilt and fear overwhelming her. Between sobs, she admitted she and Oscar had been to the cabin before. Brad played his role flawlessly, the devastated, betrayed husband. The officers soon viewed him with sympathy instead of suspicion. Both he and Marie were taken in for further questioning while forensic experts combed through the cabin for evidence. At the station, Brad contacted a lawyer he had used before. On legal advice, he said nothing more. Marie, however, was a wreck. Overcome with grief and pressure, she spilled everything. The affair's duration, where they met, even their trips to the cabin. Detectives took detailed notes, using her emotional breakdown to extract more information. Brad wasn't worried. She knew nothing of his real plan, so nothing she said could incriminate him. After a long night and most of the next day, both were released but instructed not to leave town. Weeks passed as investigators examined every angle. In the end, no solid evidence contradicted Brad's self-defense claim. A man had broken into a home at night, and legally Brad had the right to protect himself. Despite lingering doubts, the case was ruled justified homicide. A jury would have sided with him. On Sunday, Brad drove Marie home. She was shattered, racked with guilt, desperate for forgiveness. She apologized repeatedly, her voice raw with regret. Finally, he silenced her with a cold command. "Enough, Marie, just stop." Of course, he had known about the affair for months, but he played his part well, his face unreadable as she confessed everything. Despite everything, a part of him regretted it had come to this. Eliminating someone wasn't easy, but he saw no other way to reclaim his dignity and rid himself of the man who humiliated him. By Monday, he was back at work. Marie wasn't. She was falling apart. That evening, Brad found a neighbor keeping her company, worried about her emotional state. Over a tense, silent dinner, Brad finally confronted her about the affair. She broke down completely, offering every cliché excuse. "It meant nothing," she sobbed. "I love you, Brad. Please let me prove it to you. I'll do anything." Her words meant nothing. By Thursday, she was served divorce papers. Still drowning in guilt and grief, she nearly collapsed when she saw them. Losing both her husband and her lover in the same week must have been crushing, but it wasn't his problem anymore. When she spiraled into a panic attack, Brad had to take her to the emergency room. She clung to him, begging him not to leave her, as if he were the only thing keeping her together. Later, as he packed her belongings, she sobbed desperately. "What am I supposed to do now?" Brad zipped the bag shut, barely looking at her. "I don't know, Marie, but it's not my concern anymore." Tears streamed down her face. "You don't mean that. You love me." A bitter chuckle escaped him. "You seemed fine without me before." "I made a mistake. If you just—" His patience snapped. "Then go find yourself another plaything," he said harshly. "Maybe this time pick someone with a big enough toy, since that seemed to matter so much to you." She gasped as if he had struck her. Her sobs deepened. Brad didn't care. By the weekend, he was gone. Though never formally charged, suspicion followed him. Law enforcement kept tabs, occasionally questioning his acquaintances. His career suffered. People hesitated to trust their finances to a man rumored to have orchestrated a homicide. Eventually, he quit, found another job, and kept a low profile. The house and cabin were sold, and he and Marie split the proceeds. Brad walked away with half their assets and the funds he had secured before filing for divorce. He kept his lifestyle modest to avoid scrutiny. Life moved on. He hit the gym, shedding weight and rebuilding muscle. He stayed close to his daughter, who struggled with how their marriage had ended. She even pleaded with him to reconsider. "That's never going to happen," he told her. Too much had happened. There was no going back. To his surprise, dating was easier than expected. The women he met were older, mature, and many still stunning. It took time to regain confidence, but once he did, he realized how much he had missed companionship. He wasn't looking for anything serious yet, but for the first time in years, he felt in control of his life. At 55, he had his health, his independence, and good years ahead. Loneliness no longer consumed him. Marie, however, crumbled. Losing both her husband and her lover shattered her. She withdrew, isolating herself. The carefree, seductive woman was gone, replaced by regret and self-loathing. She let herself go, stopped exercising, stopped caring about her looks. The confident woman who once attracted younger men had become a shadow of herself. She never returned to the spa, the place where her downfall had begun. In time, Brad heard she was leaving town. The gossip, the judgmental stares, the whispers, it had become unbearable. She had no choice but to disappear.